The meeting at the White House will go down in history as the most strategic blunder that the United States of America showcased the continent of Africa.
What happens when a meeting meant to heal a diplomatic rift ends up driving the two sides even further apart? In Washington, US President Donald Trump and South African President Cyril Ramaphosa sat down for what was supposed to be a reset in relations. Instead, the encounter veered off course, leaving economic opportunities untouched and political tensions heightened. Across Africa, the outcome was seen not as a bridge built, but as a warning for how the continent should approach Washington in the future. So how did a carefully planned diplomatic engagement unravel so quickly? Let's find out. The atmosphere inside the Oval Office was thick with anticipation when President Cyril Ramaphosa stepped through the door. Cameras flashed, aides took their positions, and for a brief moment, the meeting looked every bit like the diplomatic reset it had been billed to be. The early pleasantries came easily, two leaders exchanging light conversation about golf swings, ceremonial gifts, and the potential for a new chapter in relations. For those watching, it seemed like both sides were ready to put the past aside. That illusion lasted barely 10 minutes. Without warning, US President Donald Trump shifted the conversation away from formalities and straight into one of the most contentious accusations ever leveled by Washington against Pretoria. From a neatly stacked pile of manila folders on the Resolute desk, Trump produced printed reports, photographs, and video clips. Some were pulled from online sources, others from advocacy groups long accused of promoting selective or misleading narratives. All of them carried a single explosive message: that South Africa's government was complicit in systematic violence and dispossession targeting white farmers. The mood in the room changed instantly. Reporters, who had been allowed in for the opening moments, were ushered out. Advisors on both sides leaned in, their posture stiffening. Trump described the situation in blunt terms, calling it state-backed persecution, and insisting that the US had a duty to speak truth about it. He referred to graphic clips in front of him as proof, placing them on the table for Ramaphosa to see. Ramaphosa did not flinch. In a measured but unmistakably firm tone, he rejected the premise outright. He told Trump that the violence in South Africa's rural areas was part of a broader national crime problem, one that tragically affected black, white, and mixed-race citizens alike. He stressed that no credible legal or statistical basis existed for the claim of a racial extermination campaign, and that his government's land reform program was guided by constitutional safeguards, not racial retribution. The South African delegation listened intently as their president methodically dismantled each piece of so-called evidence placed before him. Several of the photos, Ramaphosa noted, were unrelated to South Africa altogether, and one was traced back to a conflict in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Others were outdated or lacked verification. While avoiding open confrontation, his counterpoints made clear that he would not allow South Africa's domestic policy to be reframed through what he called a foreign lens of selective outrage. As the discussion deepened, the tone between the two leaders became sharper. Trump insisted the issue could not be ignored. Ramaphosa insisted it could not be misrepresented. The economic proposals Ramaphosa had prepared, a multi-billion-dollar package involving energy imports, infrastructure investment, and industrial partnerships, remained in his briefing folder, untouched. The conversation had been hijacked by the confrontation over race, crime, and sovereignty. By the time the meeting broke, neither side could claim a diplomatic victory. Trump's team left convinced they had confronted Pretoria with hard truths. Ramaphosa's team left certain they had defended their country against unfounded and politically motivated claims. In the hours that followed, the details of the exchange began to leak, first through whispers in diplomatic circles, then in bold headlines across African media. The story was framed not as a mutual attempt at reconciliation, but as an ambush. In Pretoria, government officials quickly moved to brief journalists, framing Ramaphosa's stance as one of dignity under fire. In other African capitals, commentators took a harder line, seeing the episode as a warning about the perils of engaging with Washington under such conditions. What was supposed to be the beginning of renewed cooperation was already being read as a fresh fracture. And yet, to truly understand why the meeting reached this breaking point so quickly, one has to step back and examine the months of political maneuvering, public accusations, and policy decisions that led up to it. The Oval Office clash didn't materialize out of thin air. It was the final act in a long-running deterioration that had been unfolding in plain sight. Well before Ramaphosa boarded the flight to Washington, the diplomatic climate between the United States and South Africa had shifted from cautious cooperation to open antagonism. It began with rhetoric. From campaign rallies to policy briefings, Donald Trump repeatedly singled out South Africa as an example of what he portrayed as racially discriminatory governance. His language was blunt, accusing Pretoria of marginalizing white citizens and undermining property rights through its land reform agenda. By framing the country's constitutional reforms as a racial vendetta, Trump drew international attention to a highly sensitive domestic issue, and in doing so, touched a nerve in Pretoria that would never fully settle. Words quickly turned into actions. The White House announced the suspension of U.S. foreign aid to South Africa, a move that carried more symbolic weight than economic impact, but sent a clear political signal. Within weeks, South Africa's ambassador in Washington was expelled, forcing Pretoria to operate without its highest-ranking representative in the U.S. Capitol. Then came a more unusual policy step, a special refugee intake program, tailored specifically for white South Africans claiming to be victims of targeted persecution. For South Africa, each of these actions was more than just an isolated policy decision. They were read as public challenges to its sovereignty and as attempts to validate a narrative that Pretoria had spent years rejecting. The refugee program in particular was viewed as an implicit endorsement of the white racism claims that South African officials insisted had no factual basis. At the same time, Pretoria's foreign policy choices were drifting further from Washington's orbit. South Africa maintained strong ties with countries that the U.S. saw as adversaries, including China, Russia, and Iran. Its positions at the United Nations often diverged sharply from American resolutions, particularly on Middle Eastern conflicts and international sanctions regimes. To the Trump administration, these moves signaled an unreliable partner. To Pretoria, they were the mark of an independent foreign policy unwilling to bow to external pressure. This widening gap was mirrored in the trade arena. U.S. tariffs on South African goods, particularly steel and aluminum, were among the steepest imposed on any African country. Negotiations to revise these terms had stalled repeatedly, and Pretoria was increasingly looking to diversify its export markets. For South African policymakers, the economic frustration was compounded by what they saw as an American unwillingness to separate trade policy from political disputes. By the time Ramaphosa's visit was announced, the stage was already set for a difficult exchange. In Pretoria's eyes, the trip was a chance to reverse the downward spiral through a mix of economic incentives and diplomatic engagement. In Washington's eyes, it was an opportunity to put unresolved grievances on the table, in Trump's characteristically direct style. It was also clear that the audiences each leader hoped to reach were not the same. Ramaphosa wanted to reassure African partners and international investors that South Africa could navigate even the most turbulent diplomatic waters without compromising its principles. Trump, on the other hand, was speaking not only to his domestic political base, which had taken a strong interest in the plight of white South Africans, but also to segments of the international community sympathetic to his framing of the issue. When the two finally met, this mismatch of priorities left almost no room for neutral ground. The political distance between Washington and Pretoria had grown so wide that even carefully scripted moments were at risk of collapse under the weight of their unresolved disputes. All it needed was a trigger, and once the Oval Office conversation turned to the topic that had dominated months of headlines, that trigger was pulled. The meeting's collapse might have been dramatic, but it was entirely predictable given the context. To see why, we need to examine how those divergent priorities and deep-seated mistrust translated into the specific moments that defined their face-to-face encounter. Let's pause for a second to say, big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. From the moment the two men sat across the Resolute desk, the difference in their approaches was clear. Ramaphosa leaned into diplomatic formality, measured tone, deliberate phrasing, and the kind of steady composure designed to set a cooperative mood. Trump, by contrast, operated on a rhythm that shifted unpredictably between geniality and confrontation, often collapsing the distance between casual remarks and political bluntness in a matter of seconds. The first exchanges were formal, almost ceremonial. Trump opened with talk of shared business opportunities, referencing American investment potential in African energy and infrastructure. Ramaphosa responded with affirmations about U.S.-Africa economic cooperation, hinting at the proposals in his portfolio without yet unveiling them. But beneath the small talk, both leaders were working toward very different objectives. It was Trump who broke the surface first, pivoting abruptly from trade to what he called serious human rights concerns, signaled to an aide who stepped forward carrying a leather-bound folder. From it came a stack of glossy photographs, followed by typed summaries and QR codes linking to online videos. The images were stark: crime scenes, grieving families, farmland in disrepair. "This is what I'm being told is happening to white farmers in your country," Trump said, his voice rising slightly on the word happening. Ramaphosa took his time before responding, not immediately looking down at the materials. Instead, he met Trump's gaze and began outlining South Africa's official position. That violence in rural areas is part of a broader, nationwide problem and not a targeted campaign. His choice not to address each image directly at first seemed deliberate, an attempt to keep the conversation anchored in verified data rather than emotionally charged imagery. Trump pushed harder. He referenced testimony from advocacy groups and individuals who had appeared on U.S. television, describing South Africa as on the brink of a racial crisis. He pressed Ramaphosa on whether his government was prepared to protect property rights in the face of land reform legislation. The question was less an inquiry than an accusation, delivered in a tone that left little ambiguity about Trump's skepticism. Ramaphosa countered by explaining the constitutional safeguards built into South Africa's land reform process, emphasizing that it was aimed at redressing historical injustice without undermining economic stability. He spoke of parliamentary oversight, judicial review, and the necessity of public consultation. At one point, he reached into his briefing folder and slid across a document summarizing crime statistics over the past decade, figures that contradicted the narrative of targeted racial violence. The aides on both sides observed in near silence, their eyes moving between the leaders like spectators at a high-stakes chess match. In the pauses between exchanges, the tension was palpable. The South African delegation kept their notes close, whispering only when necessary. Trump's team occasionally leaned in to point out specific lines in the material he had presented, reinforcing their position without breaking the president's lead in the conversation. There were moments when the exchange seemed poised to reset, with Trump briefly acknowledging South Africa's regional influence or Ramaphosa expressing openness to joint initiatives. But each time, the dialogue circled back to the same fault line: the competing narratives over land reform and rural violence. Neither leader was willing to let the other's framing stand uncontested, and each rebuttal seemed to pull them further from common ground. By the midpoint of the meeting, the original agenda, trade, investment, and cooperation on security, had receded entirely into the background. Instead, the discussion had become a duel over perception, with both leaders acutely aware that what was said in that room would reverberate far beyond it. For Trump, the confrontation offered a chance to project firmness to his domestic base. For Ramaphosa, it was a stage to defend not just policy, but national dignity. The encounter ended not with agreement, but with an uneasy handshake that did little to mask the strain between them. Both men left the room knowing the optics would be scrutinized, dissected, and spun by audiences with very different agendas. What happened next was shaped less by what was said face to face, and more by how each side chose to tell the story afterward. And that is where the economic dimension comes in, a side of the meeting that could have been a breakthrough, but instead became collateral damage in a political battle neither side was willing to back away from. Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. By the time the conversation in the Oval Office had shifted into a stalemate over contested narratives, the economic material Ramaphosa had brought with him was still untouched in his leather briefing folder. That was not by accident. He had planned to introduce it only after the initial diplomatic exchanges had created a more cooperative tone. But the tone never came, and the proposals that could have reshaped U.S.-South Africa commercial relations stayed largely on paper. The centerpiece of his pitch was a 10-year liquefied natural gas LNG purchase plan. South Africa's energy sector has long relied heavily on coal, and Ramaphosa saw LNG imports from the U.S. as both an environmental upgrade and a way to deepen economic ties with Washington. The plan was ambitious, up to $1.2 billion per year in U.S. LNG sales, coupled with joint investment in port infrastructure to handle the imports. Pretoria had run the numbers and believed the deal could make the U.S. one of its top 3 energy partners within a decade. Alongside the LNG proposal, Ramaphosa had structured a package of duty-free quotas for American exports, covering vehicles, steel, and aluminum. South Africa was offering a concession that would directly benefit U.S. industries hit by global oversupply and low prices, framing it as a strategic trade balance measure rather than a one-sided favor. Pretoria's economic team had calculated that these quotas would support thousands of U.S. manufacturing jobs while giving South African industries access to specialized American equipment and technology. The package also included targeted investment invitations for specific American firms. Elon Musk's companies were a prime example. With Musk's South African heritage and global profile, Pretoria saw his ventures, particularly in renewable energy and electric vehicles, as symbolic and practical bridges between the two countries. Ramaphosa's aides had prepared briefing notes highlighting potential factory sites, local supply chains, and incentives for research partnerships in battery technology and solar infrastructure. If presented under better circumstances, these proposals could have been the headline of the visit. They were designed to appeal to Trump's emphasis on American exports, job creation, and energy dominance. They also positioned South Africa as a gateway to African markets for U.S. companies looking to expand on the continent without navigating multiple regulatory systems. But when the meeting's momentum turned toward political confrontation, the economic agenda became a casualty. Introducing the proposals in the middle of a heated exchange over sovereignty and human rights risked appearing transactional, an impression Ramaphosa was unwilling to give. Instead of unveiling the full details, he mentioned the trade framework only briefly, without the pitch-like delivery his team had envisioned. The moment for negotiation passed almost as quickly as it arrived. Trump's reaction to the economic overture was tepid at best. He acknowledged the LNG idea with a nod, asked a few logistical questions about port capacity, and then returned to the topic that had dominated the meeting. For the U.S. side, the energy and trade proposals seemed secondary to the political disagreements that had already taken center stage. No commitments were made, no timelines discussed, and no follow-up meetings scheduled. In Pretoria, the fallout from this missed opportunity was immediate. Business leaders who had been briefed on the potential deals expressed frustration that months of preparation had been eclipsed by a dispute that, in their view, could have been managed more diplomatically. Energy analysts noted that without a breakthrough with the U.S., South Africa would likely turn to other LNG suppliers, most likely Qatar or Mozambique, closing the door on what might have been a landmark U.S.-Africa energy partnership. For Ramaphosa, the failure to advance the trade agenda during the trip was more than just a lost deal. It was a vivid demonstration of how political discord can derail economic diplomacy, even when both sides stand to benefit materially. And beyond South Africa's borders, the rest of Africa was watching closely. The way the meeting ended would not only shape Pretoria's next moves, but also signal to the continent how it should approach, or avoid, its high-level engagements with Washington. When news of the Oval Office meeting filtered back to African capitals, the reaction was not confined to South Africa. From Nairobi to Abuja, political analysts, government ministers, and media commentators dissected the events, reading them as more than a bilateral spat. What they saw was a litmus test for how Washington intended to engage with African leaders, and the result in their eyes was a warning. The first layer of the reaction came from South Africa's immediate allies within the Southern African Development Community (SADC). Statements from senior officials in Namibia, Botswana, and Zimbabwe framed the meeting as an example of why African governments must be cautious in accepting U.S. invitations framed as resets. They pointed to the way political disputes had eclipsed economic cooperation. concluding that no trade deal or investment promise could survive if Washington chose to prioritize ideological disagreements over mutual benefit. Further north, in West Africa, the response carried a more strategic tone. Nigeria's Foreign Affairs Committee issued a briefing noting that South Africa's experience underscored the need for African states to diversify trade and security partnerships. Ghanaian commentators echoed the sentiment, pointing out that Africa's growing ties with China, Russia, Turkey, and the Gulf states were not just about investment. They were about shielding the continent from unpredictable shifts in U.S. policy. On the continental stage, the African Union quietly amplified this narrative. While it did not issue a formal statement condemning the meeting, AU officials used closed-door sessions to emphasize the importance of maintaining African unity when dealing with powerful external partners. Several diplomats involved in those sessions later revealed that the Ramaphosa-Trump clash was cited as a textbook example of why individual African states should avoid entering high-stakes negotiations with Washington without broader continental backing. In the business community, the verdict was equally clear. African CEOs and trade bodies interpreted the meeting's breakdown as confirmation that political risk remains a major factor in dealing with U.S. administrations, especially when domestic American politics intersect with African policy. For them, the missed LNG deal was not just South Africa's loss, but a signal that U.S.-Africa economic relations could be vulnerable to derailment by issues that have little to do with commerce. The fallout also had a subtle but significant cultural dimension. African social media platforms lit up with commentary, celebrating Ramaphosa's refusal to accept Trump's framing of South Africa's internal affairs. Memes, opinion threads, and grassroots commentary portrayed the South African leader as standing firm against external attempts to rewrite African narratives. This groundswell of public sentiment bolstered Ramaphosa's image at home and resonated in other African countries, where leaders are often accused of bowing to Western pressure. Washington's reading of the situation was more complicated. While Trump's domestic supporters praised his bluntness, foreign policy advisors privately acknowledged that the meeting had deepened Africa's perception of the U.S. as a partner willing to impose its political framing rather than seek common ground. This perception was already influencing African voting patterns in international forums, where U.S.-backed resolutions were facing increased resistance. Perhaps the most lasting consequence was the acceleration of Africa's pivot toward alternative partners. In the weeks after the meeting, South Africa advanced discussions with Qatar and Mozambique on LNG imports, explored new defense agreements with Russia, and announced an expanded trade mission to Beijing. Other African states took similar steps, using the South African example as justification for broadening their diplomatic and economic portfolios. In the end, the Oval Office encounter did more than sour one meeting. It reshaped the calculus for how Africa will engage with Washington in the foreseeable future. The message that echoed across the continent was unambiguous. Africa would no longer approach the U.S. as a primary partner by default. Instead, it would treat Washington as one option among many, to be weighed against alternatives that offered respect for African agency and freedom from politically charged conditions. And in that shift lay the true strategic fallout of the day, a quiet but decisive realignment that began not in a grand geopolitical summit, but in a tense room in the White House, where two leaders met with entirely different visions of what partnership meant. Was this just a meeting gone wrong, or something much bigger? Did Africa gain more than it lost by walking away? Let us know in the comment section what the next move will look like. Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.